Hello, welcome to this video on Harpoon Captain's Edition Vassal Module version 1.1. In this video I will demonstrate how to use the Vassal module to play a double-blind game with a referee. Of course, it's just going to be me playing this game, and I'll be switching back and forth between the referee, NATO, and Soviet player screens. Alright, so let's begin. This is going to be a similar scenario to the previous one, so I'm going to switch to NATO. Could be a little bit of a twist on this one here, just to demonstrate how the double-blind system works. So we'll have, this time it'll be a tanker, and Arleigh Burke escorting it, and this is the primary target of the Soviets. For fog of war purposes, I'm going to have two task forces consisting of merchants. And in this scenario example, the Soviet player will have to positively identify his target before sending a backfire strike against it. So we're going to randomly pick task force numbers, also to add to the confusion. There will also be a combat air patrol of F-18s. So I'll pull that card out just for quick reference. Okay, Task Force 3, 7, and 10 are being used by the NATO player. So we'll right click and select the movement chits. As another example of fog of war, in the previous video, if you recall, we used dummy cards with dummy task forces to create ambiguity, since you can see all the task forces on the map. But even in this case here, the turn movement box is visible to all the players. So if you wanted to add additional task force counters to the cup in order to create a little more confusion as far as to how many task forces you have, then I think that's acceptable, and you would not have to create dummy task forces on the map anyways, since they cannot be seen. Now I'm going to switch to the Soviet player for his setup. As previously, he'll have two flights of backfire bombers, one flight of Bear D. He's going to be using the Patrol A marker, which I'm going to just go ahead and put right on top of him, so when he gets deployed, it'll be all set. Now I'm going to turn these guys all invisible. You'll notice they turn to light color. So when you see your counters as a light color, that means it's invisible to the opposite player. When they turn back into a bright color, they are visible to the opposite player. Now I'm going to do deployment of the NATO task forces. If I remember right, we used 3, 7, and 10. Yes. Plus a combat air patrol of an F-18. Also going to use a cap indicating the radar status is on. I will combine those two, group select that, and set them on Bodo. I will need speed markers, so I'll group select those, make them invisible. And doing this now on the counter sheet will prevent your enemy from seeing you deploy it to the map. Okay, Task Force 7 is the one that has to reach Bodo. Okay, from here at a speed of 2, it'll take 3 turns to get there. And there's going to be other merchants out and about, all of which are headed to Bodo, but for the purposes of this scenario, it's the tanker that the Russians are after because it has, let's say, jet fuel for aircraft, whereas these other 2 task forces represent just general cargo. We'll call them neutrals, but there's no actual neutral counters in this game. We'll return back to referee. One thing I forgot to do for the Russians was to put a Patrol A marker in the cup. Now the Soviets could do the same thing with additional patrol counters or even task force markers to create the unknown for the NATO player. Okay, I think we're ready to begin. I'm going to left click and draw and select task force 3. Increase his speed to 2 with the radar off. Oh, pardon me, I was supposed to be the NATO player first. Okay, here we go. So it moves 1, 2 hexes. Ends his turn. Selecting task force 7. Increase speed. Increase speed. Remember that the black side represents radar off and the red side represents the task force radars on. It doesn't actually matter who draws from the cup, but typically the referee would do it. And just instead of switching back and forth for expediency, I'm just doing this at whatever player happens to be up at that time. And of course the Soviets are going to go last. And this is what the Soviet player sees. Nothing. That is fog of war. Okay, on the bases, deploy Patrol A. And he's at this, just like the other scenarios, there's a suspicion of cap at Bodo, so he has to stay at least 2 hexes, actually about 3 hexes away from Bodo. So we'll fly to this point here. He's outside cap range. He did not fly through cap coverage, so we're okay there. I switch to the referee. Now, patrol aircraft are, of course, always assumed to have their radars on. But if you break apart the stack, and even the Soviet player can do this. This is Show Surface Search Radar. It has the overlay of the correct number of hex radius around this aircraft. So the referee would determine that 2 task forces have been detected. So group select, turn it back to visible. I'll go back to the Soviet player. This is what he will immediately see. I probably should have cleared the movement tracks before doing that so you don't see where they came from. That creates just a little more fog of war, I suppose. So Mr. Soviet player now sees this. So what we have to do is the NATO player, because he's controlling these neutrals, will now have to place those detected task forces on the combat board. Well, it's actually the detected / combat board. So he has positively identified 2 merchant vessels that are not his targets. Retire. I'll just show you the Soviet player. When he opens up his detected board, he sees now the task forces. So no airstrike will be called for this turn because these are not his primary targets. I'll switch back to referee, put on the turn move, and we'll go to next turn. All the chits are brought back to the cup, and once again we draw from the cup and it randomly selects the task forces. So task force 10 will now move, and he remains detected. Task force 7, I really should have switched him back to NATO. Hold on a second. Try to determine if there's an ES. I don't think these merchant ships would theoretically have ES for detection purposes. Anyways, task force 7 now moves. So now part of the problem with this is that he knows these 2 task forces were detected. That gives him an approximate area in which the enemy patrol aircraft could exist. But that's no different than a head-to-head game where you have all the counters on the map anyways. In that sense, you still know who's been detected. But at least here, you still don't know where that enemy patrol aircraft is. So NATO player moves there. He's still outside the patrol aircraft's radius. Task Force 3 moves next. I'll stay as the referee for now just because these guys are just automatically going to Bodo anyway. And of course Patrol A goes last again, unfortunately. For him anyway. Okay, this is what the Soviet player sees. He still has radar contact with both of these task forces. But he knows there's a third one out there somewhere that's his real target. He also knows he has to stay well away from Bodo. So if we go here, and you can see where we're searching, but yeah, what if the other guy's being sneaky and going up the coast? In here, there's no point in getting closer to Bodo because if he does make it there, that's a win for him anyways. So let's go with that. Now we move back to the referee, and he sees this. So Task Force 7 is detected, but by ESM, so too is the Russians. Okay, switching to the NATO side. Now NATO sees everything, and of course the Soviets now see everything except for the combat air patrol. NATO player then, well, here's, yeah, the NATO player can see which marker Patrol A represents. Previously I had used the patrol aircraft boxes for placing the markers, but when using the invisible traits you can just place it with the patrol marker, so when you make it invisible, or rather visible, both of those are shown at the same time. Just saves you a step. Okay. Oh, I know more. I forgot what I was going to do. What I'm doing is taking Task Force 7 to the detected board because it is now detected. And the Russians are going to send an airstrike. From Severomorsk. Their combat range means they could go anywhere on the map. Just so you know. So we're going to go here. Going to go here. We're still got to stay outside of cap range, but we need to be within 3 hexes of our target. I don't think there's any provision in the game for shooting missiles over somebody else's task force like that. I don't think. But at any rate, that's going to be the attack. Bring up the markers screen. Pardon me, the markers little window. Going to switch to the referee for the combat. Because there are 2 flights of 4 aircraft each one has 2 missiles. So we'll use 2 8 missile factors. And as before, we'll break apart into the escort and the escorted. And because Task Force 7 is within combat air patrol range, there will be an interception of the missiles from the cap aircraft. Air-to-air value is 2. Missiles have an air-to-air value of 0, so that's a defensive 0. So that's a +2 for the cap. So it'll be 1 die, because there's only 1 aircraft in the combat air patrol, with a +2. Which is a 7. That results in a hit. All hits to missiles are automatically destroy a missile, so we'll decrease that by 1. And now we have long-range SAM fire from the Burke. That'll be 10 missiles at 0 modifier. And according to the SAM table, 4, 5, and 6 are hits, with 6 being a double hit. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 hits. I'll use the keyboard minus key. 1, 2, 3, 4. That was very unfortunate for NATO. Now we're going to that would be the defender gets to pick which missile factors are struck by the SAM fire. And now there's no short range SAMs, but the defender would have to allocate the missiles before short range SAMs anyway. But Arleigh Burke has a point defense of 3, so 3 dice. And the point defense column, only a 1 is a miss, with a 6 being a double hit. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 hits on the missiles. And now we roll for the SSM attack. A 1 and a 2 is a miss, with a 6 being a double hit. Looks like a total of 3 hits on the Burke. Has a hull value of 2. So obviously, and we'll check these off on the roster sheet, he is sunk. Return him to deck. Delete that marker. The poor tanker has 5 missiles coming after it, which then generates 3 or higher, so it's 1, 2, 3 hits. Oh, it has 4 hull. So tanker 1, 1, 2, 3. It's alive, but it's going to be reduced to a speed of 1. I'll go back to the Soviet player, since the Soviet player now would have to send his bombers back to the airbase. Oh, it helps if I click on both of them. And in the bases, you can see they appear now in the flown aircraft box, which means they are not available for the rest of the turn. Which doesn't matter too much because that's pretty much the end of the turn. Now I'll go back to the referee. That is in fact the end of the turn. So I'll push the next turn button, and then I can show you the bases where the aircraft were automatically moved to the ready aircraft box. Task Force 3 moves. He only needs a speed of 1. And he makes it to the base. I think the only way now patrol or the Soviet player can win is if right there as if he gets drawn first. He still has radar detection of Task Force 7 and can, and probably will, send another backfire raid after it, which would, I think, guarantee a Soviet victory in this scenario. Well, there's no point in continuing the rest of it. Hopefully this was a good demonstration of how to use this module as a blind play with a referee. Thank you for watching.